Hey everyone, Alexander Rebel here. Many people have suggested that I make a video series about DSLR photography. So here I am today with my Canon 5D full frame camera. I use this camera to take my photos. Now what I'm going to cover in this video are just the basics of using a DSLR camera. I'm going to cover aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. I'm going to tell you what those three terms mean and how they relate to your photography. So let's get started. First, I'm going to talk about the aperture. If you have a Canon DSLR, you'll be able to turn this dial at the top of the camera to the setting marked AV. What this does to your camera is allow you to change the aperture manually, but everything else on the camera will be calculated automatically by the camera. Now let me tell you what aperture is. Think of the human eye. On a sunny day outside, your pupils get smaller and allow less light into your eyes. And when it's dark, your pupils dilate and allow more light to enter your eyes. The aperture of a camera works the same way. Inside the lens of a camera, there is a section that works exactly like the human eye. It can dilate to let more light in, or it can close down to a pinpoint to let less light in. So how does this apply to taking photos, though? Well, if you're taking a photo outside in the middle of the day, you won't want the inside of your lens to be dilated, or your photo will be far too bright. What you want is a smaller aperture. And conversely, if you're taking a photo in dim lighting, you want the aperture to be larger and let more light in. So here's how you change the aperture. Aperture is expressed in photography using the term f-stop. The lower the number of the f-stop, the more dilated the inside of the lens is. And the higher the number of the f-stop, the smaller the aperture is. So right now, I have the aperture on this lens to f3.5, which is as wide as this particular lens goes. Now this lens I have here, on the other hand, is a lens specially designed to have an aperture that opens up close to as wide as an aperture can go. This lens can open all the way up to f1.4, which you would typically use in very dim lighting situations or in night photography. Lenses with an aperture that can open up as wide as this one are typically very expensive, but necessary if you want to do night photography or photography in bad lighting situations. But for now, I'm going to assume you don't have an expensive lens and you have a typical lens like the one on this camera. What I'm going to do now is to take a number of photos of the same thing with different aperture settings, starting with f3.5 and then going to f7.1 and then f16. I would encourage you to try the same thing, just to see the results. The way you adjust the aperture on your camera depends on the model of camera you have. This is a Canon 5D and it has a small screen and dial on the top of the camera. So I'm going to take the photos now and we'll examine the results. As you can see here at f3.5, the foreground of the photo is in focus and the background is blurred. This is what a wide aperture does. Having a wide aperture will limit the number of elements in your photo that will be in focus. So let's look at the photo now taken at f7.1. As you can see, the background focus is much better and the foreground is still in focus. So logically, I'm sure you have a good idea of what the f16 photo will look like. Most everything in the shot is in focus in this photo, so ideally when you shoot a photo you want your aperture to be as small as possible to get more of the shot in focus. However, as you take these photos you'll notice that the shutter speed gets slower and slower as the aperture gets smaller and smaller. And that takes us to shutter speed. I'm going to explain what that is now. So what is shutter speed? Well, it's not as complicated as aperture is. Shutter speed is how long the shutter covering the camera sensor is open. If you turn the dial on the top of your camera to TV now, this will allow you to manually set the shutter speed, but now with everything else calculated by the camera. Shutter speed as a number is expressed in terms of 1 second. So if you set the shutter speed to 125, for example, that means the speed is 1/125th of a second. Now, while taking those three photos at the different aperture settings, you'll likely notice the changing shutter speeds. At f3.5, the shutter speed was considerably faster than it was at f7.1, and much faster than it was at f16. That's because a smaller aperture will always require a slower shutter speed, and conversely, a wider aperture will require a faster shutter speed. So why does shutter speed matter, though? Shutter speed matters depending on what you're shooting. If you want to shoot something that's moving, such as a basketball player or a car, then you can't have a slow shutter speed. You need your shutter speed to be as fast as your aperture will allow. In the middle of the day on a sunny day outside, that moving car will be easier to shoot than it would be at sunset because you can have a smaller aperture and a faster shutter speed at the same time. So what you have to ask yourself when you're taking photos is as follows. 1. Do I need a faster shutter speed or a slower shutter speed? And 2. Do I need everything in the photo to be in focus, or does only the subject need to be in focus? Considering these two questions will allow you to figure out what aperture and what shutter speed to use. And be warned, in some situations you just can't have everything you want as a photographer. Often you'll have to make sacrifices. I'll discuss lighting in future videos because that's several steps above the basics. But in short, the better the lighting, the fewer sacrifices you'll have to make as a photographer. That's why the lights are so bright in professional modeling shoots. But now let's move on to ISO. Okay, so what is ISO? Well, for one, it stands for International Standards Organization. Why? Well, because cameras once took photos using film, and different types of film had different levels of sensitivity to light. The International Standards Organization created a universal scale for measuring film sensitivity to light, and that scale is still used in DSLR photography. Having personally had the chance to work with actual film cameras in my life, I am very thankful to be able to adjust the ISO of my photos on the go. Of course, there are still many professional photographers across the world that are still very loyal to film photography, but in most cases, DSLR photography is far superior to film photography. But anyway, what is ISO? Basically, ISO is how sensitive your camera's sensor is to light. The lowest setting your camera can probably go to is 100. That's the least sensitive setting, and it is used in favorable lighting situations. The highest ISO on your camera varies depending on the model. My 5D here goes up to 1600, but this Canon Rebel T3 I have goes all the way up to 6400. But what does it mean? Like the other two elements I've already discussed, there's a choice you have to make with ISO. A lower ISO means better resolution in your photos, while a higher ISO means poorer resolution in your photos. So let's switch the dial on the top of the camera to P this time. As you can probably guess, this setting allows you to manually set the ISO, while everything else is calculated automatically by the camera. I encourage you to experiment with this setting and then observe how the resolution of your photos grows poorer with the higher ISO. But that does not mean you always want to shoot with a low ISO. Sometimes you have no choice. If you want to photograph a specific player at a dimly lit youth hockey game, for example, you're going to need a higher ISO because you want that faster shutter speed. If you set the ISO at 1600 and the aperture as wide as it can go, chances are that you can get some good photos of the fast-paced action at the hockey game. But in order to do all of that, you'll need to break free from automatic calculations by your camera. You'd be surprised to know how many professional photographers are afraid of the manual setting. If you switch your camera to M, that means you have the power to control all three of the elements I've discussed yourself. You may want to take a few test shots on one of the automatic settings to get a feel for the settings you'll need on the manual setting. But shooting manually is likely the best way to get good photos in whatever situation you're in. To conclude this video, I'll show you a number of photos I've taken myself, and I'll give you a shameless plug for my website as well. Thank you very much, and I'll see you next time.